Today we're going to look at why Henry VIII wanted to annul his marriage to Anne of Cleves. Now, Anne of Cleves has unfairly gone down in history as the Flanders mare, as you can see in that picture to the right. Now, it was said that while her painting depicted her as attractive, Henry said that she was so ugly that he would be unable to consummate their union. And in fact, within 6 months, their marriage had been annulled. It is worth noting, however, that whilst Henry was unkind about her appearance, there were many others who were far more complimentary about the young princess. For whatever reason, Henry took a dislike to her. Henry VIII first saw Anne of Cleves in December 1539, soon after she had landed in England. "I like her not! I like her not," he was famously meant to have shouted at Cromwell. Some say that this might have been after he attempted to approach her, but without knowing who he was, Anne pushed him away. Now, we don't know exactly what happened in this encounter, or whether it even happened, but if there is any semblance of truth, this would have insulted Henry and possibly could have contributed to his subsequent determination to end their marriage. Henry desperately tried to avoid the marriage, so much so that it was even postponed for 2 days. However, as Cromwell rightly pointed out, Henry had made an agreement to marry Anne of Cleves and signed a treaty to say so. Cromwell persuaded Henry to do the right thing and to go through with it. But Henry must also have realised he had little choice. He needed an alliance, for at that moment Charles V and Francis I were meeting at Paris, and for all Henry knew, they were plotting an invasion of England. And so the couple were married on the 6th of January 1540. That night, Henry was unable to consummate the marriage. The next day, he reported to Cromwell that he had left her as good a maid as I found her. This was a clear indication of his displeasure at the match, and given that he was desperate for another son, the situation would need to be resolved, and with some degree of urgency. It wasn't just her appearance that convinced Henry that their marriage had been a mistake and could not last. Anne simply did not fit into the sophisticated life at court. She was shy and had grown up in an uncultured household, so she didn't have the finesse and the skills expected of the Queen of England, especially compared to Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Anne's education, which had been under the control of her mother, had centred on needlework and household management. Meanwhile, the skills that she needed for the English court, such as singing, dancing, playing a musical instrument and languages, had not been taught in Cleves, as they had been considered unnecessary. At this time, there was also the involvement of Catherine Howard. Now, as previously been the case, Henry had fallen in love with a lady-in-waiting to the Queen. On this occasion, it was Catherine Howard, a young, vivacious teenager who Henry found much more to his liking. She was not only more attractive, but rather than being shy like Anne, she was young and flirty. Only a couple of months after his marriage to Anne of Cleves, in the spring of 1540, Henry started to pursue her seriously. In the spring, it was also apparent that an alliance with Cleves was no longer required. The alliance between France and Spain had broken down, meaning that the joint invasion from the Catholic powerhouses in Europe was no longer a threat. As a result, the goodwill of Cleves was no longer deemed important. The change in international relations was something Cromwell had no control over. However, its implications were significant both for the King's marriage and Cromwell's fall from power later that year. With no foreign policy consideration to hold him back, the King began to take action against his marriage. So by the start of July, Henry had his marriage annulled on the grounds of non-consummation. He also claimed that there had been a contract existing already between Anne of Cleves and the Duke of Lorraine. By stating this, Henry was pushing the blame for the failed marriage onto Cleves. As a result, by the end of the month, Catherine Howard had become the fifth wife of King Henry VIII. At the humiliation of being branded ugly, Anne of Cleves was the wife who came out the best from her marriage to Henry. In return for her meek acceptance of the annulment, she was richly rewarded with several manor houses, including Hever Castle, the former home of Anne Boleyn, making her very rich in her own right. She was also given a considerable annual income and granted the official status as the king's sister. At a time when women were subject to the whims and rules of their husbands, Anne never remarried and lived a life of splendour, being treated with honour at court. The terms granted to Anne meant that except for the king's children and future wife, she was more important than any other of his subjects. Now, the type of question that you might get is something like, how far was the annulment of the marriage to Anne of Cleves due to Henry's dislike of Anne? You may refer to the dislike of Anne of Cleves, or the fact that the alliance of Cleves was no longer required, but you must remember to refer to your own information as well as these bullet points. So when answering the question, you will need to ensure that you include the information in the title, so in this instance, Henry's dislike of Anne of Cleves. Also, make sure that you refer back to the question explicitly stating why his dislike of her led to Henry annulling the marriage. At this point, you could mention her lack of courtly skills, alongside her appearance and lack of likeness to the portrait. You could also mention in a separate paragraph the change in foreign policy and the reduction in the threat from France and Spain, making sure that you point out that as a result of this, the alliance with Cleves was no longer required. And then lastly, as your own information, you could use the fact that Henry VIII had fallen for the young, vivacious Catherine Howard. Now, if it's a 16-mark question saying how far, remember that you need to finish with a conclusion giving a judgment on how far the annulment was down to Henry's dislike of Anne in comparison with the other factors which also contributed. However, if it's a 12-mark question, as long as you've given relative importance throughout, this conclusion is not required. This is C.L. Barber, 1977. Thank you for watching.